Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H Virtual Event Space. You are tuned into the Beauty of Travel series featuring our wonderful friend here, Jim Nix, hosted by Sony. So a huge thank you to them. And today it's part 3 of 3. We are talking about street photography. And if you have missed the perfect parts 1 and 2, we're going to get those links dropped in there. So we suggest that you catch up on those as you can with the rest of our content. If you go to YouTube, just look up the B&H Event Space. You can also check us out on Vimeo at B&H Event Space on there. Jim, welcome.
Hello, Derek. How are you? Thanks for
Doing
having
just
me.
wonderful. Always great to have you on. It's kind
Thank
of
you.
sad. I know this isn't going to be the last we see of you, but whenever we wrap up a series, it's always sad. So
Yeah, I agree.
we're gonna turn it over to you, let you do your thing, and remind everybody that Jim is going to be taking questions throughout. So if you have them, don't wait until the end. Drop them into the comment section if you're joining us on YouTube, Vimeo, or over there on the B&H website. If you're right here on Zoom, we do have the wonderful Q&A module. So I'm going to get out of the way, turn it over to Jim, and Jim, I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I will start sharing here and just confirm you can see my screen if you would.
Yes, sir. Looks
Awesome.
good.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And thanks, everybody. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks, Derek, for the intro. Thanks to B&H and Sony for sponsoring and hosting this. I appreciate that. I'm Jim Nix, based in Austin, Texas. Not necessarily a mecca for street photography, but it's a great city. And like any city, which I personally can substitute the term small town for city, because street photography to me can kind of happen anywhere. And we'll be talking about that today. I've got a few slides to go through and show some example photos, and of course, have some images that I'll be editing in Luminar Neo. If you don't know me, you can find me on my website, which is jimnix.com. All this stuff is down in this bottom left corner of this kind of title slide. I'm very active on YouTube, make 2 or so videos per week, depending on what's happening and what I'm inspired to talk about. But I'm always doing tutorials around different things. And of course, I've got an active Facebook photography page and an Instagram page. Like to thank B&H and Sony for having me. And what I want to do is kind of walk through a few things that I'm going to talk about here and share kind of my thoughts around street photography. As I said, it can kind of happen anywhere. And for me, street photography is one of those things. It kind of reminds me of the term fine art photography, in that if you ask 5 or 10 or 20 people how they define it, you would get 5, 10, or 20 potentially different answers. There may be some similarities, some overlaps in those answers, but I feel like a lot of people have a certain connotation when you say street photography. And I don't know if I fall in the traditional sort of definition of it. As far as Sony gear goes, I've been shooting with Sony for about 7 years now. Absolutely love it. This is my current lineup. My original camera was the A7 Mark II. My current camera is the A7R Mark III, which is just a beast, and I love it. And I've got 2 Sony zoom lenses, the new versions of both their wide angle, as you can see, the 16-35, and their 24-70. And as far as prime lenses go, which are the things that I'll be kind of talking about and discussing in today's session, prime lenses, I have the 14 mil, which I don't use for street photography. That's really a landscape lens. But I've got the 20 1.8G, the 24 1.4 GM, and the 35 1.4 GM. And those 3 I do use for street photography. And that's one way I think that I may differ in terms of how I kind of do street photography. I think a lot of people think, oh, 35 or 50 mil, or even longer perhaps. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's up to your taste. As I say a lot when I'm editing photos, season to taste. I also think shoot to taste. I tend to have a little bit of a preference for a wider view. And so for me, you could maybe think of it as like environmental street photography, situational street photography, as opposed to perhaps a more classic definition where it's a little bit tighter view of somebody doing something. But for me, the 20, the 24, and the 35 are the ones that I use for that now. Although a lot of the sample photos that I have, I took with previous lenses that I don't have anymore, some Sony lenses, and I'll talk about those. But you can kind of do it with any lens. I don't think that it necessarily matters. I just think for me, it's a muscle that I like to exercise, because otherwise it sort of atrophies, as with many kind of creative things. I've said this in the other 2 webinars. I'll say it again real quickly. I'm a huge fan of this quote, simply because photography is a very active pursuit. And in the case of street photography, it's you can be passive physically, but you're very active mentally and visually trying to find a shot. Meaning you could be standing still waiting for someone to walk into a scene that you've already kind of envisioned. And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. So it could be inactive physically, but it's very active because you're scanning the environment and looking for something to make that shot complete. So for me, street photography is, and this may not necessarily be the right way to do it, but the way I do it is typically I don't really have a plan. I may have an idea of where I want to go or the kind of shots I want to do. And some of that will inform what lens I bring, because of these lenses, when I go out to shoot in the streets, I'll usually just take one and I'll just focus on using that lens the whole time. I've even taken trips where I've gone to other cities and I just bring one of these lenses and that's it. And that's it's a forced education, but it also, I think, it causes you to look at scenes differently and things like that. So anyway, those are things I think about. As far as top tips, I'm a huge fan of prime lenses, partly because that lends itself to the next one, which is time of day considerations. I generally like to shoot in a little bit lower light. That could be sunrise. I'm a big fan of getting up in cities and shooting at sunrise, even for street photography. And that's partly because I like to capture a person or two people, just maybe a small amount of people in my street photos most of the time. And those people, you're less likely to have big crowds at sunrise is what it comes down to. So time of day considerations, but also prime lenses, because they shoot with these really bright apertures. You can just open it up to f1.8 or 1.4, like in those lenses that I've been talking about, and shoot handheld, which is another thing I really like to do. You don't have that tripod and all that. So I like to keep it really simple. Camera, one lens, run and gun. Be ready, be patient, all those kind of things. I think that's important. As I said, sometimes you get to a place and you're like, this would be a cool scene if I just had a person walking through it to give it a little bit of context. That's where the patience comes in. Being friendly and respectful, right? You're talking to people on the street, at least potentially, and you may be taking photos of them. In fact, you probably are. There have been a couple of times when people have said, hey, did you take a photo of me? And my opinion is, because of me, again, going back to what I said earlier, a little bit of an environmental kind of street photography, I'll say, I took a photo of this environment and you're in it. But I have had people say, I don't want you to have a photo of me. Will you please delete it? And of course I will. So I want to be respectful of people just as I would want them to kind of treat me, right? Same thing our parents told us. And then experiment. Have fun with it. Speaking of lenses, by the way, and they can drop links in the chat. The 20 mil f1.8, small, powerful, really just beautiful. I use it probably more than I use any other Sony lens for anything. I absolutely adore that lens. The 24 at 1.4, also small, solid. These are just beautiful, beautiful lenses. And the 35 1.4, just fantastic lens. I love these prime lenses and just love shooting with them. Things that I look for, human element, right? It's a street photography. To me, essentially requires two things. It's a city, or perhaps I should say an urban environment, and there's a human in it, or potentially humans. Otherwise, it's kind of like cityscape photography, which we talked about in a previous episode. I do, if possible, try to find a way to tell a story with an image. And sometimes, I mean, the stories are subject to interpretation, of course, for the viewer. But if you can find interesting gesture or, interesting context, or something juxtaposed, in the environment that makes for an interesting kind of conversation, even if that conversation is just going on in the viewer's head. The whole telling a story thing is interesting to me. And I think sometimes I pull it off. Admittedly, sometimes I don't, because, this is not posed photography. This isn't, planned photography. This is spur of the moment kind of photography. And, you don't always get what you get, or you don't always get what you want. You do get what you get. I'm looking for light. I tend to look for color. And I know a lot of people think, oh, traditional street photography is black and white or monochrome. And I like monochromes, but at heart, I'm kind of a big color person, and I like those pops of color. So the majority of my street photos are in color. And then I look for framing. If there's a way to frame things or something like that, it comes in quite useful, I think. I was with Derek and the B&H team in New York this summer, and we walked around, and this gentleman was hanging out selling chicken out of his booth, if you will. And we were just chatting with him. And as often happens, especially if there's a group of you all walking around taking photos, people stop and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" And this is an opportunity to say, "We're out taking photos of the street. Can I take your photo?" So I did, but I also, something I like to do is talk to the person and get their email address, and I'll just send them a photo. I'm clearly not selling these photos. These are street photos. I'm not getting a model release or anything like that. I'm just doing it because it's just fun to do. And so I emailed this gentleman this photo, but things like that are kind of fun. And as you can see there, that shot with the 20 mil. So I am getting a little bit closer than normally, but regardless, I like being able to get a lot in my photos. The next one was also in New York. This was the day before our photo walk up there, and I was walking around, and I was actually just kind of shooting street scenes, which is more like cityscape. And this one is kind of an in-between, I guess. It's kind of like a street photo in that I've got a couple of people there looking at their phones, which is a common gesture. I talked about gesture a couple of slides ago, but it's a common gesture these days in photos. But it's also just kind of an environmental thing. You got the coffee shop, you got the bike, and we had a pretty decent sunset. All that just kind of puts it together. To me, the story here is like they're placing an order for coffee that they're going to walk inside and pick up, or they're trying to figure out where they're going next. Maybe they just had a coffee. Maybe they're trying to figure out where should we go because we're photographers and we want to go take a picture of this sunset that looks like it's coming together. You never know. It's again up to interpretation. But this is another example of using that wide 20 mil, and just all these are handheld. But I was able to get the sign on the side of the building where it talks about the coffee. It's got the bicycle kind of pointing along with a line in the sidewalk straight to those two gentlemen there, and then straight onto the sunset. So lines and angles, same kind of things you often look for in any photograph. Another one from that same photo walk in New York where we came across these two gentlemen. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, people will say, "Hey, what are you doing?" In fact, I think Derek was talking to them first, and then we started chatting with them. We're like, "You want your photos taken?" And these guys were willing participants. They stuck around for a few minutes and kind of posed and that sort of thing. So we had a good time. And, again, street photograph, street portrait, really, and 20 mil. And that's why I said it's kind of environmental. I kind of like that, they had these solid colors on that were like clean white shirt, nice clean red shirt, that sort of thing. And then kind of gritty, grungy background that's a little bit dirty. It's kind of been tagged, right, by graffiti artists, things like that. So a little bit of a difference between the subjects versus kind of the background. Speaking of backgrounds, this is in London, which is an amazing city, my favorite place to go visit, actually. And I feel like it tells a little bit of story, and I also like the way color is used here. He's painting, and it's white and yellow, but he's wearing these dark blue colors. Blue and yellow are complementary colors. They go together really well, so he really stands out. Whereas if you imagine he was painting down there on the far left end, where it's a dark blue background and darker colors, he wouldn't stand out nearly as well. He would blend in. So it doesn't quite fit the same. And also, this is an example of where it's clearly a lot of graffiti. It's called the Leek Street graffiti tunnel. It's really close to the London Eye. If you have ever been there, or if you're going, it's really fun to walk through. But he's got on jeans and a blue shirt, but they're really clean. There's no paint or anything like that on him, and yet he's surrounded by this kind of grungy, dirty sidewalk, lots of grunge and grit. And so again, some of that color difference helps him stand out, and some of the difference with him being clean blue shirt that doesn't have any marks on it versus a really messed up background. This was something I shot a number of years ago with my original 24-70 f4 Sony lens. And again, shot it at 24 mil, so fairly wide, because I like that kind of environmental look. For me, it helps me tell a better story in terms of how I look at things. So just something that I think about. This one could be theoretically controversial is probably the wrong word, but I don't know what the word is. But I was here, and this was in Portland, Oregon. I was using the 35 mil f1.4, and I was walking around at night trying to just take some photos of street scenes and that sort of thing. And I saw this spot called Red Light, and I was like, that's just really cool. It's like a vintage shop, and it's super grungy, and if you can't tell from some of these photos, I like grungy stuff. If I ever get a chance to shoot urbex, I would love to, but I like grungy streets and that sort of thing. But I also like the kind of the difference between a female who's, not exactly dressed up, but she's not grungy at all. I saw her coming down the street, and I was there was like an island in the middle, and I was just kind of leaning on a pole, just acting like I was taking a photo of the shop, which I actually was doing, but I was actively waiting for her to walk into my scene. And so it's a photo I like quite a bit. The other thing too is I didn't focus on her. I really focused like on the door and the window because I wanted her to be a little bit in motion. So, she was moving kind of fast. And so it's a little bit of a story there, like a lady who's maybe she's dressed up and going somewhere, but maybe she's walking by this spot that's kind of grungy, and maybe she's in a hurry because it's lower light, it's nighttime, things like that. So another reason I like color is like it's red light, it's a red building, but she's in kind of black and white. Just, I don't know, lots of things, very much subject to interpretation. But I just kind of like scenes like that where you can kind of catch people kind of going about their business and they kind of fit in and tell a story. And the other thing here that I think is important is it looks a whole lot better that she is where she is in the photo versus like in the middle or on the left side of the frame. Because if somebody's walking, you want to give them as much leeway in front of them to finish walking kind of through the photograph. So if she was in the middle or further to the left, there wouldn't be very much room for her to kind of finish walking through the frame, like visually or mentally for the viewer. And I think it wouldn't look as good. So I wanted to catch her, basically on the rule of thirds grid, where she had essentially, let's call it 2/3 of the photo left to go. Because I think as a viewer, you can see that and imagine yourself walking through this scene. Whereas it looks like it's already over if she's way on the left-hand side. So something I think about as well is that timing aspect. Okay, so this one also with the 35 mil, and I was walking around. It was a food truck park in Portland, and I really like the graffiti. I like graffiti and I like kind of grungy stuff, and there's a fair amount of that in places like Portland, and really any big city, I guess. But I kind of liked it here. It's like it looks a little bit like the mural or the graffiti, whatever you want to call it, kind of that steampunk face of the female. She's looking at me. But this gentleman was up there literally doing what the graffiti is saying, which is wash your hands, but he's looking the other way. It's like he doesn't want to look at her, but she's looking at me. I don't know. It just kind of worked. I just kind of like that. And I like that he had on blue jeans and those blue Crocs because they kind of stand out against the otherwise kind of desaturated lower part of the image. So I don't know. It kind of worked. I wish he'd had like a red shirt on, and I guess theoretically I could go change that, in post, but I tend not to do those kind of things to street photos unless it's really necessary. But anyway, things like that, just kind of catching people doing this stuff that they might otherwise normally be doing. I don't know if you would call this photo a cityscape or a street photo, but to me, it's a street photo. I was standing in the street taking a photo, so it's kind of a street photo in that regard. But it's just people walking by and talking and hanging out outside of a bar here in Austin at night. And that's one of the reasons I like having these prime lenses that you can shoot with this really bright aperture because, ISO 1000, but at f1.4, I'm getting a nice shot without having to worry about, a tripod or any of that, because none of the tripods they don't work for me for trying to do street photography. It's just, you don't have time to set up, right? I saw these people walking, same thing as in the last photo, where these two gentlemen were kind of walking in from the right-hand side, whereas the other gentlemen here in the center were kind of stationary. But I wanted to catch these two before either they're in front of these, because then that would look crowded, and I wanted to give them plenty of room to walk. So something I think about when I'm out shooting. Now, this one I shot with the 28 millimeter f2, which was the first prime lens I had for my Sony, and I don't have it anymore because I'm shooting with the other ones that I've already mentioned. But this was in downtown Austin, and obviously this is a black and white. It's inside an old barbershop downtown, and I was walking by actually with a client. We were doing some cityscape and street photography, and I was just talking to this gentleman. And I was like, "Hey, can we take a couple of photos inside your barbershop?" And he said, "Yeah, for sure." And there were no customers. So then he goes in there and he starts combing his hair, and then he's quick to finish and put his brush down. And I was like, "Hang on a second. Can you do that again? And can you kind of pose for me, for lack of a better term. And so he did. And I like the juxtaposition. I like the reflection, but I also like the kind of he's got like a classic kind of traditional old school kind of look. Like if it wasn't for his tattoos and the prices that you can clearly see up here on this menu in the right hand side, you would think, well, this photo was taken 50 years ago kind of thing. He's in a white t-shirt, he's got cool hair. It's just the tattoos look modern and the prices look modern. So it's a little bit of that, I don't know if juxtaposition is the right word, but that difference or that contrast. Let's see, I've got a question here. Jim, do you find times that one of the small compact cameras like the RX100 are best to not draw attention or concern of others, or does it matter? That's a great question. And I had the RX100 Mark 7. I don't have it anymore, but I did use it for some cityscape and street photography. And it's great because it has a nice zoom range and a pretty bright aperture as well. And so if you want to be a little further away from people, then that can work really well. And I totally agree that a smaller, less obtrusive camera than a full frame Sony can be good if you want to be kind of stealthy, ninja-like, however you want to kind of think of it in terms of your shooting style. That maybe that's another reason why I shoot kind of environmental street stuff, because the camera, they're mirrorless cameras, but they're full frame, so they're small, but they're not tiny. They're way bigger way smaller than a DSLR, of course. But I like that single prime lens, and they're small, and it's much better to me than having like a 24-70 or 70-200. Nothing wrong with those. I want to be less obtrusive. I don't want to draw attention to myself, because I do want to catch people generally doing something that they might be doing otherwise, because otherwise you might startle them, right? Almost like shooting wildlife, and you could scare them off, so to speak. So yes, a small camera like that could absolutely work. It just depends on what you like. And I like the images from the full frame Sony so much. So anyway, I posed this gentleman, and I just kind of like that contrast between him having kind of a traditional older look versus the tattoos that he has, and the prices being fairly modern looking. So this is one from London, and I shot this with my wide angle, as you can see, the 16-35. This was the f4, the first version of that wide angle lens that Sony came out with, and I shot this a number of years ago with my first Sony camera. But you can see I shot it at 35 mil. So even though I was carrying around a wide angle lens and I was shooting some city stuff, I came across an opportunity where this, to me, kind of told a story. And I wasn't about to like, oh, well, hold on, let me set my bag down, get it off my back, change lens, all that. You just wouldn't get the shot. So I took the shot, and I would say arguably I needed to back up. I probably needed to do less than 35 mil. I feel like I need a little bit more foreground because he's really close to the bottom of the frame. But I like the story that it was kind of telling, which to me is you find a person kind of by themselves, apart from the crowd, and he's looking at his phone, which is very much a singular person thing. You're not talking to your friends while you're also looking at your phone necessarily. You're pretty much in your own little world. So it's like he's in a crowd around people, but he's in his own little world, and he's also standing apart from everybody else. And so I don't know, it tells a little bit of a story of kind of modern life in some regard. So I like trying to find things like that. But that was just a quick snap. Ideally, I would have shot it a little bit differently, but it is what it is, and you get what you get. But those are the kind of things I like to look for. And actually, a completely different trip that I was on, and a different lens that I had on. But essentially, if you look, the previous photo, it says urban decay on the left-hand side, and it says urban decay on the left-hand side. I literally just turned the corner from that previous shot, but again, on a different day and with a different lens. Here, I had the 28 mil f2 prime, and I was shooting some city stuff and some street stuff. And I was sitting here trying to figure out, how do I shoot this little street? Because I just kind of like shooting streets. But I was also capturing some street photos, not just cityscapes, but street photos. And then this couple was kind of walking toward me, and I already had my camera out, was kind of trying to frame it and figure out what to do. And they stopped and started taking selfies in front of me. So as far as I'm concerned, that was them raising their hand / volunteering to be in my photo, because I was clearly standing there with my camera up and, framing things and that sort of thing. So they stopped. They were taking selfies of themselves, or an ussy, I guess you would call it, there. And so I took the photo. The other thing I like here is this gentleman with the girl on her back. She has her hand in a gesture. It's almost like she's pointing at them and saying, "Look at these people," right? Her hand's kind of pointing that direction. So things like that you just come across, and being able to shoot with the prime lens, I just think you can make a quick adjustment to your settings, pull things off pretty quickly, that I find easier to do and less fuss really than messing around with a different kind of lens like a mid-range or a zoom. This is in Austin. Here's a food truck at night. And this one was, by the way, I don't know that I said this yet, but I often, when I'm taking photos in the street, I don't really like very often to be taking photos of someone coming toward me. I prefer to either have them from the side or from the back. It doesn't always happen. Like that one I showed you a couple of minutes ago, the guy looking at his phone, he was coming towards me, but he wasn't paying attention. But I like to be pretty ignored, I guess is the best word. I don't want people looking at me and knowing that I'm taking their photos, just because I don't want to draw attention to myself and that sort of thing. So I'll often take photos of people from behind. So I was in this little food truck court in downtown Austin, and these people were lined up. And I thought, that could be a pretty cool photo. The way they were spaced, and they weren't together, it didn't seem like, because they weren't talking. The way they were spaced, I thought was pretty cool. But what I like about this photo was both of the girls seemed to be looking at the gentleman who's sitting kind of up here in the front of the bus. And it looks to me like he's looking in this rearview mirror and looking back at them. So it's kind of like they're having an interaction separately, even though they're all kind of together. So I don't know, it just kind of interesting. And, that was just something I came across. And so I find stuff like that kind of fun. Let's see here. Fran is asking, does f1.4, f2 give you enough depth of field in shots where multiple people are on different planes? It depends. If you're not close to the the subjects, then sure, you can get pretty decent depth of field. But if you're a lot closer, or if like one's really separate and you're focused on them at that really bright aperture, then a lot of the stuff in the background may blur out. So it just kind of depends on how the scene's arranged. But if you think about it, like if you're shooting at 1.4, but you're shooting at like infinity, you'll still get a lot of stuff in pretty decent focus. So hopefully that helps, Fran. And I'm a big fan of taking a lot of photos. So I like this quote quite a bit as well, because I take a lot of photos, and of course I only share the ones that I like, but I got plenty of terrible photos, blurry photos, messed up photos, photos that just don't tell a good story, things like that. It's just as we all do. So I'm going to play around with a couple of photos, and we'll go into some things. I'm trying to figure out where to start. Maybe I'll just start with this one. I mean, you've already seen this photo, and I've got to move this zoom window. My apologies, just 1 second. But this one is that scene from Portland. And, the thing is like with cityscapes and with landscapes, I'll do potentially quite a few steps to edit those photos, because I want to control light and color. It'll often require masking of a lot of different things, a lot of different elements, because I'm trying to make the scene look either the way I remember it looking. And of course, as you know, the raw file doesn't capture everything the same way that we see it, right? Raw files obviously are a bit flatter. So my landscapes and my cityscapes tend to get, perhaps a wide variety of filters, or at the very least, a higher number of filters or tools. But when I'm doing street photography, it'll often be pretty simple stuff. So I've got a raw file. I will start here and, maybe a little bit of contrast, maybe put on the highlights. I like to leave a little bit of shadow. I don't want to, a lot of people will brighten up shadows and things like that, but that doesn't look like a night shot anymore. I kind of want to play up the fact that it's a night shot. That adds, I think, to the element of, I don't know what the word is, not spookiness, but it adds to the mood of the shot, I think, a little bit. And then sometimes I might cool things off a little bit on the night shots, but that's just a personal preference, that I like some of the bluer kind of look more than I like the yellow or warmer look. But, it just depends on what you like is really what it comes down to. Now, another thing I'll do is I'll go get something like structure, and I'm in Luminar Neo. And so I make a lot of tutorials about it. If you're not familiar with how to use it, it's an incredibly powerful editor. It's got a lot of similarities with Lightroom, for example. But if you're interested in learning about it, I've got a lot of tutorials on YouTube that you can check out. I'm going to go into masking here, even though I just said I don't do as much. I might come in here, and for structure, I might add a little bit of structure, and I'm just kind of painting here. There you go. It's catching up. Just on like part of the photo, kind of here in the center, I just want to add a little bit of structure to create a little bit more crunch. It is a little bit of a grungy scene to my eyes. And so adding a little bit of structure, which is a little bit like adding a little bit of texture, I think kind of plays into that a little bit. And so I'm not even sure how well you can see this. Yeah, it doesn't come through real well. I'm going to do the same thing here. And this is a tool called Enhance AI, which does a lot of stuff. It's kind of like a super tool, super filter, where it'll play with light and contrast and color and things like that. And so that's why I'm masking it in, because I only want to do this in the same kind of central area. By the way, I could have used the mask from the last tool and just copied and pasted it here. I just, it's hard for me to do those kind of things and think about them when I'm also talking to you. So this one is just kind of popping at that central area a little bit. But if you look at the before and the after, it's just a little bit brighter, a little bit more intensity. And then I might just hit it with a little bit of a vignette. And I like to add vignettes to my photos, especially street photos. And I just think it helps kind of focus the attention of the viewer on whatever you think the subject is in your photo. There's a cool little feature called Inner Light. And I'm going to click Choose Subject, which is going to select the center of the vignette for me, which I'm going to put over here, kind of in front of the lady. And so it's going to brighten up that section because I used Inner Light, and the vignette is going to be centered around wherever I clicked to choose subject. So it says choose subject. It's the same thing, same idea as choose center of vignette. That's really what it's doing. But the vignette's going to, of course, darken the edges a little bit. And then with Inner Light, I brighten the center a little bit. And, you know, street photos, I could crop it a little bit, take out a little bit of the extra stuff on the top. But, I mean, just a pretty simple edit. All I'm doing is playing up the light a little bit and added a little bit of texture with the Structure AI and a little bit of pop in the center with Accent AI, just to make it stand out a little bit more. So that's kind of a quick edit. I'm going to do a few of these. A lot of these are really just quick edits, to be honest, because like I said, there's not really a reason to do a lot of edits, you know, in my opinion. This
Jim,
is in London.
Jim, I want to jump in real quick before we got this one started. We just had a question come in from Sean joining us on Zoom, asking if you manually set your ISO or if you use auto ISO.
I actually manually set my ISO. Great point, though. I mean, it's probably makes sense quite often. It's just not a habit I've ever gotten into. So I've always just manually set my ISO, but I can generally get a feel for it. Like, you know, there's always going to be, you know, you're doing street photography in cities, right? So you're not doing it out in the woods. So there's going to be some light, even at night from the city, right? Whether it's that shop window, like in the last one, or street lights and things like that. So I usually set it at like 1,000, 1,250, 1,600, and then just kind of go from there, because I don't mind having a little bit of noise. You can clean that up in post if it's really bad. But even on night shots in the city, having some noise, that it doesn't bother me like it does if I was trying to shoot like a skyline or a cityscape or a landscape. I want to clean up noise there. It doesn't bother me if I'm having some noise in street photography shots, because to me, by definition, street photography has a little bit of an edginess to it, a little bit of grit. It doesn't bother me to have a little bit of noise. But yeah, I just set it all manually. And if for some reason I'm already shooting wide open at f1.4 and it's still too slow of a shutter speed, because I'll often shoot in aperture mode. It's just a habit. I'll just bump up the ISO a little bit, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I do it.
Perfect.
Yeah. Develop raw again. I got a basic raw file here. So situation like this, I might pull down the highlights a little bit. I might lift the shadows, but I don't want to do too much of a change to the overall light distribution. What I really want to do is focus on her. And so with that, you can come in, like I said, get a vignette, and you can just drop that vignette, add a little bit of inner light, choose the subject. She is the subject. So I'm going to put the inner light focused right on her backpack. So you can kind of see that that's brightening the center of the photo. And then, of course, I've darkened the edges because it is a vignette. So a little bit of redistribution of light. There it is. You can tell it's like white around the edges, so it's brighter. And then the darker colors, like the blue and all that, are in the center, and shifting that around a little bit, lightening some of those things. But one of the other things I like to do is to enhance kind of what she's, how she's, to enhance the light and get the viewer a little bit more focused, is I'll go back into to develop. I'll get a linear gradient. And, the same kind of thing you could do in Lightroom or, whatever editor may be yours in terms of your preference. And then I just added a linear gradient, and all I'm going to do is darken that a little bit because it's pretty bright, and these colors were moving and stuff. So it was kind of a, it's like take the shot because she's in position. I couldn't wait for something else to happen. And there weren't a lot of people coming through. But you can see, one of the things I like to do is play with color. And so I've just, with the temperature intense slider and that mask, I've just taken this area over here and I've made it darker, and I've essentially shifted the tones to get it away from that brighter overall color. So I'm trying to tone that down because it's a little visually distracting, as is admittedly the pattern, which is this pattern over here on the right-hand side being reflected, but I can't do anything about that. The only other thing I would do here is go into HSL, and with HSL, I might get the luminance value of the red and the yellow and just lift them a little bit in order to kind of pop that and make her backpack and her a little bit brighter. So I'm going to do something like that, and then I'll just get a brush, and I just want to mask that in. I'm going to left bracket key to make it a little bit smaller. And this will be a really rough masking job. All I'm doing is just basically painting over her and telling Luminar, hey, whatever I just did applies to where I just painted. And so what I did was go into HSL, lift the luminance of red and orange and yellow. I don't know if there's a lot of orange in there, but maybe there is. And then I masked it in just so it's right in that area where she is, it's focused on her back. So now if you look at the before, it's a lot darker, and the after, it's a lot brighter. And, it's not ideal that there's red back here. You could play with shifting that color. You could play with this color here as well. This is just an example of the type of shot I like to take. And again, what I consider street photography, but this tunnel is between two train stations underground in London, and it's got that nice curve to it. And so I would rather have her a little bit more centered in the photo, so there was a little bit more space between her and this wall. But because of where she was walking, I would have to be over here on the right-hand side to create that space. And if I was over there, you wouldn't really see as much of a curve like around here. So I was trying to get over here so I could get more of the curve. That's the thing with taking these kind of photos. It's all kind of, from the hip, so to speak. You can't really plan it. And I just, in post, try to accentuate the things that I want to accentuate. But, pretty quickly, darker photo, too yellow and bright on the left-hand side, brighter on her. It's almost like the light's reflecting on her bag and brightening it up a little bit. And she's brighter overall as well. So pretty quick and easy to change, just kind of playing around in Luminar. So yeah, good fun. Let's see. I'm going to go to this photo. We shot this when we were in New York, Derek and I, and everybody walking around. And this gentleman was sitting there, and I don't know, it just kind of seemed to kind of fit. He looks, a little bit downtrodden perhaps. And, over here with the graffiti and kind of the grunge, it all kind of seemed to go together. And I've historically taken photos of this kind of stuff without people in it. But in the last, 3 to 5 years, I've really gotten to where I've wanted to include that human element. It just makes it more, I think, relatable. And I just think it makes for a more compelling photo. So when we were walking by and I saw this gentleman sitting there, I just wanted to snap that scene and, have a go at it. Here, I might actually would raise the highlights and raise the whites because I want those to pop a little bit, and then maybe pull the blacks back, just creating a little bit more contrast in the black and white that's here in the sign, and then maybe some more contrast overall. The other thing here that I think works is that this gentleman has dark hair and he's wearing dark shirt and dark shorts, but he's against a white backdrop. So it's kind of like black on white, whereas the scene and the graffiti is white on black. So it's, again, kind of that difference, that contrast that I've been talking about a little bit. Structure AI adds a little bit of crunch. Like I said, I think here I would just do a linear gradient and kind of blend that up into the upper part of the photo. I don't really care about the very top part, but I like to have a little bit more structure because it is a street scene. By definition, it's a little bit gritty, and I just think that looks kind of nice to have that there. And then I might come back into develop and go into masking and linear gradient and add another one. So each time I open develop, I'm basically opening a new instance of the tool. And that's how Luminar works. You can use a tool again and again, and essentially you're resetting the settings each time. So this time I put a mask up there, and what I want to do is just darken it a little bit, because I don't really care about being having a viewer be visually distracted by anything that's brighter there. And then, while I'm at it, I could come in and add a second linear gradient while still in the same instance of develop, and put it down here just to create a little bit of darkness in the very bottom of the photo. And I'm just moving this down. And so that's going to just darken that area a little bit. And there you go. So you can see, if you look at the top and the bottom, I've just darkened those both a little bit. So before and after, just kind of framing it. It's kind of like creating a vignette. The difference is with develop, you can come in with any kind of mask. I'm using linear gradients here, but you can put them in and adjust. It could be a larger or broader, a bigger linear gradient area that's covered at the top versus a slimmer one at the bottom. Whereas a vignette is going to be essentially equal coming from each side. So it gives you the ability to kind of customize a vignette, if you want to call it that. And it's kind of like a vignette. All I'm trying to do is frame the photo a little bit, which is the framing that I talked about in the very beginning. But simple and straightforward. You've also got crop, and honestly, I probably need to straighten the photo. The lines are off a little bit. You can also straighten the verticals pretty easily in Luminar. That's a setting in develop. I would need to do that too. I think I'll move on to edit another photo, but I just wanted to point that out, that if you're looking at it and it looks like the verticals are tilted backwards a little bit, they are. So you have a good eye. But also, that's something that I think about when I'm shooting with a wide angle lens. When you're kind of close and you're shooting these straight lines, in real life, they're straight. But that wide angle lens, when you're kind of close to things, it can create a little bit of that look like things are tilting backwards. Just come in and fix those verticals. And it's easy in Luminar. It's easy in Lightroom, whatever your editor of choice is. It's pretty easy to do. I think I'll do this one real quick. And this is just a couple walking down the street here in Austin. And this is another example where it tells a little bit of a story. It's a couple, and it says there's lots to taco about. This is a place that has tacos, right? There's lips, and it's a couple. So it's like, okay, so maybe it kind of says they're in love. There's lots to talk about / talk about, right? Obviously a play on that term. Lots to talk about, but they're not talking. They're walking their dogs. Maybe they're in their own worlds. It would be even more interesting if this gentleman had his right hand up and was looking at his phone, perhaps, which would kind of tell the stories like, well, there's a lot that they could be talking about. They're out together as a couple, but they're not paying attention to each other. Again, subject to interpretation. It just depends on what you think in terms of the story that you think something tells. And it's kind of what I like about street photography is you and I could both be looking at it and you could think, oh, I got a totally different story that I see in this photo. And that's kind of what's fun about it, I think. So I'm going to cool this off just a tiny bit because it was late afternoon and I like a little bit cooler look. That's just a personal preference, but a very minor change in develop overall. In fact, I may not go that cool, maybe just give that back a little bit. And then I'm going to use a little bit of structure again. So maybe a plus 20 or 25. I'm going to use a brush and just kind of paint it over this gentleman and his dog, her and that dog and that sign. They're just kind of all kind of go together. And so I think something about like that kind of works, just to give them a little extra pop. And so if you look at the before and after, I'm honestly not sure if you can tell. I can see it, but it may be hard to see. This time I'm going to copy that mask, and I'm going to go get Accent AI. And like I said before, it creates a nice pop in an image. I'm going to paste this mask. So now if I click show, you'll see I just carried the mask over from the last tool over to here. And all I want to do is just give that a little oomph. And that makes them stand out a little bit more. So that's that. And so before and after just brightens them up a little bit. And one thing I recommend is number one, take your time if you're playing with masks, right? Brush it in a little bit more carefully than I did here. I don't want to waste your time by having me be fairly precise. So, be careful with your mask, because when you're using tools like that, where you're changing color or you're changing light value, which is often what you're doing with masks, you want to make sure that you have a fairly smooth or gradual transition. So like a really soft brush, but also be, as accurate as you can with your mask, so that you don't really throw off something in the background. Before and after, it's probably a little too bright around the edges, but I'm aware of that. How about that? And that's kind of why I'm pointing it out. I'm going to choose subject, and I'm going to put it just slightly below dead center. Add a little bit of inner light, which adds a little bit more pop. Increase the roundness and the feathering on the vignette, and maybe increase the size and the tightness of the vignette just a little bit, just to create a little bit tighter look. Maybe something about like that. So before and after, maybe a little too much there. I try not to make that vignette too obvious. That one's getting to be fairly obvious. So definitely be a little careful with those as well. But, before and after, it's a little too bright in the center around the couple. Like I said, be careful with your masking, again, regardless of which app you're using. The point here was I just wanted to brighten them, add a little bit of detail, a little bit of pop. And I just liked the story of them kind of walking down the street with that sign and that sort of thing. So, but pretty simple edits, generally speaking, overall. And I want to do this one in London because I like it a lot. But again, it's a kind of a simple thing. And this is one of those photos it's kind of a cityscape, but it's kind of a street photo. I was taking photos of these phone booths, and a gentleman and his girlfriend walked up and said, "Do you mind if I take her picture there?" And I was like, "I don't care," but I already had my camera on a tripod and was shooting away. So this is one example of a street photo, if you want to use that in air quotes, where actually I had a tripod because I was already there set up and kind of shooting. I was kind of looking for people to be walking by so I could have that pedestrian kind of walking, but instead I ended up kind of having a model shoot, if you want to call it that. I think I would just play a little bit with the tones here. I don't want to do too much. I do want to cool it off a little bit, but again, that's my personal preference, simply because a lot of the lights in cities tend to be a little bit yellow, and I just don't like that a lot. I tend to cool them off, make them a little cooler, and I also, to me, they look a little bit green, and I like to take that green and get it a little bit away from that and go a little bit more toward the magenta. And so that's kind of what I'm doing here, playing a little bit with the whites and the highlights. So overall, just kind of a simple adjustment, but you can see the massive difference in the look of the photo, especially the white balance, because I just cooled it off a little bit. But I did that. And a tool I'll often use is super contrast. Depending on the photo, it's generally the tool that I use the second most. I use Develop Raw first, and then I'll go in and play with the super contrast tool. But with street photos, I don't do that quite as much because I don't often need to do the same amount of light adjustments as I might do with a landscape or cityscape. But it's really good at helping you pop that. So before and after, nice little pop of contrast, which I think looks good. And then I'm going to just do a couple of simple things here. I'm going to go into masking. I'm going to get a radial gradient. And here, I'm just going to create a radial mask, and I'm going to readjust it. I do want to invert it because I want it to be that it's focused on her. And so I don't really care about all the other stuff in the photo. What I care about is kind of what's happening here in the center. And so this is basically me just trying to create a little bit more pop in that area. And Accent AI is great at that. As you can see, it just gives a nice little bit of pop there. And it's bringing up some of the color, some of the tone, and making her a little bit brighter. So before and after, I think that looks pretty good. And then, once again, I use vignettes a lot on street photos. Again, we're just, generally speaking, trying to focus the viewer's attention. And I'll just come in here. I usually go kind of round and 100% on feathering, a little bit of inner light, and that just kind of adds a little bit more to what I was just doing a moment ago with the previous tool, Accent AI. So before and after, before and after. Notice, by the way, I didn't do anything with the reds. There's a lot of red because all these phone booths are red, but if you look at how dull the color looks and how much brighter the color looks now, when you start messing with contrast in your photos, it impacts how the colors look. And so it's something to think about. You can go into HSL and play with that further. I could take that saturation down if I thought they were too saturated. I could take the luminance up if I wanted to brighten them a little bit. That should grab those pretty well. Yeah, see, I'm getting a little bit more brightness there, but it makes it look a little bit orange. So I could go into hue and in the red and go, a little bit this way if I want a little bit more of that kind of red, or a little bit that way if I don't really like the orange. I'd rather have it be a bit more kind of that cherry kind of, candy apple red, I think is what I'm trying to say. And then saturation, maybe it's a little too much. I do like my colors, but I'm keeping it real here. Maybe pull that down a little bit. But you can see, and that's just playing with the reds in the red channel, but a little bit darker, a little bit more orange, really, and now a little bit more of that kind of candy apple, kind of brighter, more vibrant red, which I think plays into the scene and also kind of complements what I did with the white balance earlier, where it was kind of warmer and I made it a little bit cooler. So I'm getting that cool and warm interplay of them kind of playing off of each other, which is something I do in a lot of my edits. I just like to keep those things in mind. So before and after, you can just, it doesn't take much to really pop a street scene like that. And when you're in lower light, you've already got a lot of shadow and things to play with, which is fun. It's just kind of accentuating some of those things. Let's see here. Here's a photo that I really had a lot of fun with. This was in, surprise, this was in Chicago, but they have the Chicago Theater. And you've probably seen photos from here. There's some really great street photos in this area that I've seen. And I happened to be there, and I went over to this area, and right next to it is an L station. L is the elevated train in Chicago. And you can climb up on the platform. You get this great view down there. And then it was just a game of waiting until a solo human got in place. And I was waiting for someone to walk into my photo. And I waited for him to get essentially right there under the sign. And, then it's just, click, and it's kind of easy. Not really a lot to do with this photo. I think I would cool it off a little bit, but again, that's a personal preference where, to me, nighttime is cooler, cooler is bluer, right? And so I just kind of think that way. And so I'll do that kind of stuff a lot when I'm editing a photo. But, something about like that, before and after. And actually might pull up. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Accent AI, and I'm going to do the same thing as I did earlier with the radial gradient. I'm going to invert so that I'm working on the inside of that. And all I want to do is kind of pop that area with that gentleman and just create a little bit more visibility there. So let me just move this up a little bit. Something about like that. Accent AI, just give a little bit more pop. And even with this being really bright and white, I feel like I'm getting away with it. You can see there's a tiny bit of blown out highlights, but when I'm editing street photos, I don't worry about those kind of things quite as much as I do when I'm editing like a landscape or a cityscape. The only other thing I would do here is come in with the eraser, and I would probably get rid of these folks. And I don't know how well this will get them and look clean, but we're going to try. I'll go ahead and just click that. There's also a new generative AI erase tool in Luminar that I would normally use on a photo like this. It's just that because it's Gen AI based, it has to go up to the cloud and back, which means it can take a minute, and I don't want to have you wait around to watch me do that. So this will erase those, and yeah, it's a little smudgy, needs to be cleaned up a little bit, which you can do with the erase tool. You can also do with clone and stamp. You can also hide it a little bit by coming in with a linear gradient and coming in and doing a little bit of darkening in that area just to kind of hide a little bit more of that foreground. And so that's dropping it, a stop and a half, 2 stops, something like that. And that also helps, I think, direct the eye a little bit more to this person. So clean it up a little bit when you're erasing things, just to make sure that it looks right. But that's an idea of kind of how to help kind of focus the viewer's attention. But before and after, just a little bit cooler, a little bit of pop of light. Got that one guy standing there or walking, that sort of thing. It's just some of the things I like to look at. So do we have any more time, Derek? I know there's only a couple of minutes left, but I wasn't sure if we had more time or not.
Yeah, go for it, Jim.
Okay. I've got a photo here also from London, and this one was shot with the 28 mil f2. So you can see the date here, 10 of August of 2019. So about 4 years old, but I was using that lens walking around, gathering up some street images. And this is very common. It's very common scene around 5 p.m. in London, where people are just spilling out of the pubs and hanging out in the street, having a pint. But it's also common for me in terms of the kind of things that I look for when I'm out shooting. I'm going to do auto distortion correction because you probably saw that there's a little bit of distortion there. And so it'll go in and take care of some of that for me. That looks better already. You can also go into transform and fix some of these verticals and just kind of tilt it a little bit so I can straighten up that architecture that's leaning back. You can kind of see how that's coming along. It usually takes it a minute to kind of catch up fully when I'm doing this live, because it feels like a lot of processing power is going towards me being on the web. Okay, it should be done with that. I hope it's still doing a little bit. I can never tell because it's a little bit of a lag. It's still going. Okay, I'm going to pull that back from -12. Let's just call that like -7 or 8, and we'll pretend that is where we want it to be. The point was, you get it. You can go in and do these kind of things. And what I want to do is actually, I kind of like that. This is a situation where because it was kind of blue hour, it's really blue, and I'm actually going to warm it up, even though I'll often cool off city shots, as I've already talked about. This one, I feel like I need to warm up a little bit, maybe add a tiny bit of sharpening just to kind of give that a little bit more crispiness. And now that I've done that, I want to use super contrast. So this is one of those photos that for me is what I call a street scene. And street scenes can be classified in my little internal dictionary as a cityscape shot or street photography. I think of this one as being a little bit of both, really, because it is a street scene. In other words, kind of a cityscape kind of shot, but there's people in it and they're going about their thing, and there's gesture, and everybody's looking around and talking and doing something else, except for this guy. He's looking at me. I don't know if you can tell that. I'll zoom in 200. He's staring at me as I take this photo. He doesn't particularly seem very happy about it, but everybody else is kind of going about doing their thing. This guy's looking down there. This guy's looking somewhere else. Everybody's kind of going about doing their thing. This guy's like dead center, and he's kind of staring at me. I don't know. It just felt like it felt like a good kind of thing to have. I'm going to go into develop, and I'm going to do that kind of vignetting thing that I talked about earlier, where you can come in with a a linear gradient, and I want to darken some of the top of this because it's too dark. It's too bright. It's a little bit distracting. And so I'm going to come in and drop that exposure a little bit, because I don't really care for people to be looking too much at the top. And while I'm at it, I'm going to grab linear gradient again. You just back out, grab it again. And this time I'm going to come over here and do a little bit on this side. So again, this is basically creating a vignette, except that I get to create a different size in each of these areas based on whatever that area needs. So I'm going to back out, get linear gradient again. Here, just a very tiny amount. If I can get my, I didn't get linear gradient. I was thinking I wasn't getting something. Here, I'm going to do a little bit, and I like to drag that center section. That's this area here. That's kind of the fade area, the transition zone. I like to drag that out a little bit. I'm going to back out, and I'm going to get linear gradient one more time. And this time, I'll just come down here and do a tiny bit at the bottom. So like I said, I'm essentially just creating a vignette. And the entire point here, in terms of using this instead of the vignette tool, is I get to control how big the edges are around each side, because the top was a lot bigger area, and the left side and the right side and the bottom, of course, were not. Now, having done that, I'm going to go into Accent AI, and this is the one that kind of does that nice little pop. And once again, I'm going to get a radial gradient, and I'm going to invert it so that I can have it focused on this area. And all I'm going to do is stretch this out so that I get a lot of these people here. All I'm trying to do is create a little bit of pop in that area so that it's brighter and a little bit more attention grabbing. But I wanted to have that radial gradient because you can create that fade area just like I was doing with the linear gradient a moment ago. And that just creates a nice little bit of brightness in that area to make it a little bit better to see. And, that's really about, I think, all that I would do to this photo. I would crop it. It probably needs to be straightened a little bit. You can do all that in the crop tool quickly and easily. But if you look at the before and the after, before leaning back a little bit, too dark, too blue, you can't really see the people very well. And now warmed up a little bit because it was too blue, straightened it, darkened some of the edges, but brightened the center, added a little bit of pop. And, you could even come in and potentially like lighten up their faces if you wanted to draw a little bit more attention to it. So that's how I'd go about doing that one. But the key thing really is just like with all editing, it's about the light and the detail and kind of moving or maneuvering the light around and making sure that you're accentuating your subjects. And for me, that's generally speaking going to be the human in a street photograph, and just trying to make it pop a little bit. So I think that's about it. I mean, I'm happy to edit. I think there's another photo or two, but I realize that we're at time, so I don't want to drag it on too long, Derek. Are there other questions that I could answer?
We don't have any questions right now. We can open it up real quick. Did you want to edit one more, Jim? We can, if you want to do another one, we got time for it.
Okay. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll do one more. Let's see. Trying to think. How about we do this one? The guys that we met. It's kind of a quick and easy one, so that actually, you know what? No, I'm going to do this one. This one with the chicken. The guy selling the chicken. So here again, develop raw. And so what I need to do is I want to straighten those verticals a little bit. This is going to tilt that forward, give me a little bit better overall look on the verticals, because it was leaning back. I shot this with 20 mil, so kind of wide. So therefore it's kind of leaning back. Having done that, I'm going to lift the whites because there's a fair amount of white like in the menu, and I want that to be clean and clear and really well, easy to read, right? And so I want to brighten that. In fact, I might even bring up the highlights a little bit. I'll just leave the shadows the way they are, maybe a tiny bit of contrast, but there's not a lot to do there. But I am going to go into crop and just straighten this a little bit. So just a little bit straighter, something about like that, I think looks pretty good. I'm trying to be cognizant of the fact that I don't want the edge of that sign to go running off. So anyway, you know how straightening works. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this photo is his face is really in shadow, but there's a lot of portrait tools in Luminar, and Face AI allows you to actually come in and there's a face light. So I can actually just brighten his face like that. It automatically, using AI, identifies his face, and all I got to do is drag a slider. And so that comes in really handy on street photos because we have people in them. And if you shoot photos with people facing you, like this one, that tool can come in really handy because his face was really dark. Plus, he's got a hat on, so he's got that shadow over his eyes. Now, he's still got that, and that's probably a little too high at 70, but maybe at 50, you can just brighten that up a little bit, give you better visibility. And for me, especially if the human is facing you, you want to be able to see that face. That's part of the, I think, the connection that a person would make viewing your photo is kind of seeing that and be like, okay, human to human, you want that kind of ability to see the face. So I would use a portrait tool on some street photos. And then, pretty simple stuff after that, maybe a little bit of structure AI just to give it a little bit more pop on the texture. And then I actually think that I would go into develop again and actually might cool it off a tiny bit. It feels a little bit yellow. So I might go a slight bit left on temperature, but I might go add a little bit more back to the whites. Like I don't want the sign to turn blue, and stuff that's white, you run the risk of it kind of picking up that temperature change. So I'm kind of playing those two off of each other here. And then I think the last thing would just be another vignette. I've used that tool a lot today, but it comes in really handy. So high roundness, 100% on feather really every time, and a little pop in the center, maybe a little bit heavier vignette around the edges, maybe something like that, but that helps bring him a little bit more to life. And I think that's probably all that I would do. So before and after, and I probably need to straighten that a little bit more, but you get the point. Before and after, and that's I think a fun combination. One of the things I like is signs or text, because you saw that Chicago sign. I like it because people will see the photo and it'll get their attention because we read, and so they'll see it and they'll read it, and I feel like it draws them in. So I wanted that menu to be really visible. Obviously, the human face, people will connect with it, so I wanted to brighten that. But I also like how clean the menu is, but everything around it is just totally graffitied. People have written on every bit of that red wall and even on the windows, but they didn't touch the menu. So it's like this weird contrast between, hey, let's totally tag this place and mess it all up, but don't touch the menu because people got to figure out what they want to eat. And so it's interesting to me, kind of things like that. And so I find those kind of things fun to photograph. But yeah, I'd say that's probably about all I would do on a photo like that. And like I said, it really just comes down to accentuate the light. If you got a face, make sure that they can see it. And I play up a little bit of the texture, and I play up a little bit of the color contrast, and I play with the light. And mostly I just have fun editing because I find editing to be so fun, to be honest. So I think that's all I would do, Derek, on that one. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful 3-part series. Again, we dropped the links in there for you guys. So in case you guys missed parts 1 and 2, you can catch up on them. Want to send a huge thank you to Jim and to Sony for hosting this. And Jim, of course, we're going to see you back. It's only a matter of time.
Yeah,
so we'll handle that off screen. It's everybody out there watching, viewing. Take these tips into mind. Watch them as much as you'd like. I'll remind you to check out our YouTube channel where all of our live content is housed. And that's it. That's all we got for you today. Another round of the B&H virtual event space is in the books. We'll catch y'all next time.
Thank you, everybody. And Sony and B&H. Thank you so much.